Hello and welcome. Now, right through 2020, the world and India grappled with how to flatten the virus curve, but not the growth curve. As we enter 2021, where do we stand with this challenge of growth in the time of pandemic and lockdowns? Very happy to have joining me Raghuram Rajan. He's a former governor RBI and also professor of finance at Chicago University at the Booth School of Business. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Rajan, for joining us. Good morning to you in Chicago. Dr. Rajan, before we get into it, I just had a slightly different question to ask you, which is, what was it like to wake up as Raghuram Rajan in a Trump-free America? The day, I don't know, the day of the inauguration.
It was pretty much the same. This is like Groundhog Day, right? When you're at home, every day looks the same. But, it was a serious relief that we would be moving from haphazard policy to at least reasoned policy. You may disagree with the details of some of the policies, but at least there's a lot of thought and expertise that goes into it. So I think it's a big change. It's a big change for the world. Right. It will make a difference. And certainly my children are very happy.
Right. We'll come in to that a little later. But let's just let's get going with a kind of big picture question on where we stand now with the world economy. We'll come to India shortly, but just starting off with the world economy and what it looks like in 2021, because I know that it's hard to generalize. Every country is going through its own curve. So perhaps what may be a better way of framing it is to look at which are the countries that you think are doing well and where there are lessons to be learned and which aren't.
Well, that's a very hard question because the countries we thought we had learned lessons from in the first phase are experiencing now a second phase, which may be much worse and protracted than the first phase. Example, Germany, Austria, to some extent, Japan. Also, India hasn't experienced a second wave yet, so there may be some lessons to learn from India, what is happening, what is going right, and trying to sort of generalize from that. I do hope that, we've dodged the bomb, but certainly the second phase of the virus is virulent, is potentially, as we learned from the UK yesterday, more deadly. And so it's important to avoid that. Now, that said, I think the North Asian countries, Korea, China, have managed to contain the virus to a level that they can do tracking, testing, isolation in such ways to contain a fresh spread. And they've come back pretty strongly economy-wise.
Right. No, I know what you mean. It keeps changing. But I meant not just only in terms of virus management, but I also meant in terms of getting the mix right of how to ensure that the economy is not sliding beyond a certain point. From that point of view, I know, as you said, that in India, as far as the virus is concerned, fingers crossed, things seem to be looking good. But how would you look at where we stand as an economy? On one hand, there are certain numbers that do suggest an uptick, but on the other hand, things aren't that great either.
Well, let me give you the U.S. as an example. The U.S. hasn't contained the second wave. Cases are falling, but it's still early days to see whether that's a strong trend. What the U.S. has done is flooded the economy with tremendous amounts of support. $3 trillion last year, probably $3 trillion this year. That's about 15% of GDP. And when you add those up, every forecaster is predicting a very strong second half of this year. As the virus comes under control, as the vaccines get rolled out, there will be a tremendous growth in production. India, on the other hand, we are controlling at this point the virus. Mobility is increasing, so growth is coming back. The question, of course, is how damaged or how scarred the economy is. Certainly the upper middle class is not, and they're expressing themselves by spending. The real question is, what about the rest? And, unemployment now is, 18 million plus relative to the pre-pandemic period, 18 million, not 80 million, as the Manrega rules are up. 26 million families on Manrega.
Sure.
This is about 50% higher than December 2019. So there are people who are hurting, and their demand will be limited when we come back.
Right. And yes, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to ask you the sort of obvious question that, in other words, are you saying that we need to be spending much more and also spending in a way that puts money more directly into the hands of those at the lower end of the economic spectrum?
Well, let's take it stage by stage, right? The first sort of focus of spending should be to prevent a second wave, to make the vaccinations rolled out very quickly, to get as much as we can of the vaccines. So that's number one. I think number two is to help the households that are damaged, to help, certainly people put food on the table, continue the Prime Minister's Garib Kalyan Yojana, the free food, grains, and so on.
Yes.
And also, a lot of kids haven't been to school. That will set back their education. So getting the schools back on track,
sure,
getting them started up, and helping the poor with remedial education so that they don't lose years of education.
Yes.
That's going to be very important.
But, when you talk...
That's number two.
Right. Okay.
Number three in spending is infra. If you want an area where there is substantial benefit to the economy, it would be infrastructure spending, because you buy cement, steel, copper, etc. So sending money to the states are much stronger in infrastructure spending. That should be part of the action. Fourth, you have to recapitalize the banks, but you also have to improve their governance. So that's going to be an important task. But these are places where spending is quite important.
Okay. You said quite a lot. Let's try to unpack those one by one. At least on the point about spending more, that is, in a way, putting money in people's hands and stimulating demand. Now, you spoke of the US example where they've spent close to 15% GDP. The various packages announced by the government, the Atmanirbhar packages and so on, all the analysis suggests that while the headline numbers might seem big, in real terms, the government isn't spending more than 1 to 2% of the GDP. Is that a problem?
Well, if we had the money, it would be great, right? The government is obviously trying to do what it can within what it sees as the resource envelope. The question is, can the government expand its resource envelope? And there are two possibilities. One in the short term is disinvestment. We did a miserly 16,000 crores relative to the budgeted 2.1 lakh crores.
Sure.
With stock markets where they are, it is really a sad reflection on our establishment that we're not doing more at this point. The second is to create envelope, greater resources by committing to stronger fiscal consolidation over time.
Okay.
That's something that's quite important. If you can strengthen the credibility of our fiscal sort of transparency. We put numbers out, nobody believes them because we've been fudging them for so long. You need also commitment. We say, here's the path, and we always deviate from that path. How can we build stronger commitment that will allow us to borrow without the markets taking fright? So we need to do a few things along these lines. If we can do them, we will have a little more to spend. Certainly nobody's talking about spending an additional 15 percentage points of GDP every year.
Sure.
That's too much. But there are some needed areas. And I would differentiate between, stimulus, which is about getting the economy going faster, and about relief, which is helping people survive till the restrictions come off.
Exactly.
And I think relief is extremely important. Stimulus is nice to have, but comes a little lower in the priority.
No, no, you're right. Right now, you just need a kind of safety net to keep individuals and businesses alive, and people often confuse the two. But let me just come back to something which you said, which is quite strong, about this business of fudging figures. You think that that is a real problem even now, and that is actually in some ways becoming an obstacle towards India being able to access credit, of being able to borrow?
It's been a historical problem. Let me not associate it with any specific government. It's something that CAG pointed out in this government's term, the extent to which we have gone down that path. So we announce a central government deficit, but then there are so many other ways we borrow through various government organizations.
Right.
So the key measure is the public sector borrowing, and that's often significantly larger than the announced fiscal deficit.
Right.
So we need to come clean on all these numbers, because there's no point announcing a deficit and then borrowing through with your right hand and your left hand in ways that don't make it to the budget. We need to say this is where we are, and this is how we're going to come down over time. Otherwise, it reduces the credibility of the whole process, and of course, markets then don't believe anything you say.
Are you yourself convinced of the current numbers that have been projected, both for the deficit and even for, the growth forecast?
This is a difficult time. There's a tremendous amount of uncertainty.
Right.
So I think, placing a lot of weight on any numbers that are announced is going to be difficult, even with the strongest credibility.
Okay, that's fair. But there's one other route which has been, as you probably have seen, debated in India, but around the world as well, in terms of being able to raise money, which is simply to print cash. Well, in technical terms, economists like yourselves call it monetizing the debt, but in simple terms, and let's try and keep this conversation in simple terms so, the bulk of our viewers can understand. Is printing cash an option at all?
Well, we print cash, but that doesn't mean the cash stays with the public. The public deposits it in its deposit account. Essentially, what we call printing cash is the RBI borrowing through reserve issuance. The RBI has been doing a tremendous amount of it in the last few years, so there's plenty of liquidity out there. That's essentially saying the RBI has printed a lot of cash in popular parlance.
Right.
In fact, the RBI is now trying to suck back that liquidity because it thinks there's too much around there. So, the RBI has done what it could in terms of expanding the envelope. But there's a limit, because beyond a certain point, these have inflationary effects. And, we're reaching potentially that point.
Okay, no, but what I meant in terms of being able to provide those resources to the government to spend more. So I meant printing cash in that sense, that if the government is cash strapped.
Yeah, that's precisely what the RBI has done. It's bought government bonds, it's given cash to the government, and it's financed it by issuing reserves. That's like printing cash, which the banks hold.
Right.
There's only so much you can do of that, after which the banks rebel and say, I'm not going to hold more of your RBI reserves.
Okay.
So the RBI then has to suck it back. That's what it's doing right now, because it's reached the limit of what banks will want to hold, given the environment.
Okay. So what you're saying is that that the government should be using some of that to spend more and also find other ways of trying to raise resources like disinvestment and so on, and also just trying to be more responsible with your data and your numbers and your fiscal management. That's on the government side. On the side of the private sector, what are you seeing? Because here's something interesting that's happening. On one hand, you're starting to see signs of a reversal. You're starting to see an uptick in auto sales, in power consumption. Some companies are posting record profits. But the worry is that they're doing that by cutting costs, by laying off people, things like that, rather than actually invest and create more opportunities and more jobs and so on and so forth, which partly explains those job numbers you cited.
Yeah, what's been missing for a long period of time is investment. Partly our companies went on a investment binge, just before the global financial crisis. And after that, it's been very tepid. And if you look at the capacity utilization numbers, they're still very modest. So there is limited scope still for investment unless we get strong growth, strong demand growth. And part of what should be worrying sort of companies is certainly the demand for upper class goods has gone up. Look at car sales, as you said.
Right.
But the demand for two-wheelers is still quite tepid. And that's suggesting what some people call a K-shaped recovery, right? Good for some sectors, not so good for other sectors. The reality is that when you look at high contact services like restaurants, like hotels, like transport, I mean, those are areas that are still hurting because mobility is still lower than where it would be in the pre-pandemic days. And therefore, people who are employed by those or who used to be employed don't have a job. They don't have the spending power.
Right.
And as a result, after the pent-up demand is over, you will see some stabilization in demand. That is the true demand that we should be looking at. In other words, we're probably going to have a very strong rebound this year because we're coming off, very poor numbers last year, that is 2020. But the key for anybody is to look beyond the rebound.
Right.
What is the potential growth after that? And if we've had a substantial amount of scarring, we've had a lot of small firms that are unable to survive, if we have a lot of jobs that have disappeared as a result, it can help some segments of the economy. The big formal sector can do quite well because they're expanding at the expense of the small and medium, more informal sector.
Yeah.
But for longer run demand, this is actually bad news.
And also vis-a-vis jobs, because much was made of the fact that because of this kind of backlash against China, that some of those businesses, some of those jobs would shift to India. Do you see any evidence of that happening? We're seeing quite a lot of it. It's already started moving towards, Bangladesh, Vietnam, especially garment manufacturing, things like that. Is India getting any of the benefit of that so far? Or not yet?
Well, we're seeing some shift. I wouldn't say it's non-existent, but relative to our size, I think it is still very modest. I mean, clearly, when you look at comparative numbers, I saw a study by UBS the other day. When you put the cost of production in, India is actually very cheap at this point. It is comparable with Vietnam. But still, we're not seeing a move of business to India commensurate with the size of our economy. That suggests that multinational corporations, global supply chains, still are averse to coming into India because they see an environment which is perhaps more difficult than Vietnam offers or even Bangladesh offers. So I think we certainly need to reflect on what it is that is keeping those businesses from coming in, because clearly that would be an important source of new jobs as well as stronger exports. And we need, exports can be an important contributor to our demand, to our ability to produce as we go forward.
But, again, some would argue that those are slightly longer-term structural changes that are long overdue, but we still need to make. As you were saying, that right now there's a kind of urgency that many people are on the brink, businesses are on the brink, they need some kind of a safety net. So I'm trying to understand from what you're saying, because we have a budget now coming up very soon, which we're told is a budget like none seen before. But what really can Nirmala Sitharaman be doing with the way things are right now? What are her choices, frankly?
I think you need to do both, right? You need to, in the American parlance, walk and chew gum at the same time. You need to do the short run, because that those fixes will, you can't postpone. We talked about them, relief, some measure of repair, and certainly some boost to infrastructure, including housing and others, that would help revive animal spirits. But a stronger revival to animal spirits will also be laying out a future which is very promising. As we talked about earlier, one of the factors that's missing is private investment.
Right.
Now, private investment wants medium-term certainty that things are going to get better and stay better, that the environment for doing business will be positive.
Right.
And so one of the things the government has to do is reflect on what is it that is keeping private business from believing in a strong environment, what is keeping foreign investors from believing there is a strong environment. Often they're the same. And work on those to create an environment where people sort of both see the short-run measures and also the long-run measures and become much more optimistic about the future.
So listen, you've been in a sense in government when you were RBI governor. When you look at the way that the government is sort of handling everything, right now, do you see them working to a plan? Do you see some kind of design or not?
Well, I think what is a little fuzzy. I mean, I certainly think the government always works hard and is working to some kind of end. What is fuzzy is what that overall sort of architecture or plan is, right? At some level, we say we want foreign investors in.
Right.
And then we continue disputing at every forum we can the Vodafone settlement, et cetera, even though we've agreed to various forms of arbitration and they go against us,
right.
We continue disputing that. So that sends a certain kind of signal. We say we want them in, and then we change the rules on them abruptly, sometimes apparently to favor large domestic interests. So again, people say, well, am I willing to commit money for a long time if they're going to change the rules? Domestic business. How are the rules in a particular area going to be over time? Are they going to be changed unfairly against me? Should I continue lobbying every year to make them? So businesses want certainty. They would like, obviously, fairly light regulation if possible. But whatever regulation is there, they would like it to be relatively certain and not changed on a whim.
Right.
Similarly, they would like, a reasonable sense of what the tariffs will be, what the taxes will be. If you keep changing those around, you're changing the basis of competition. Today, businesses are competing on very thin margins. And one change in an input tariff can completely sort of demolish the business case. So I think we need to recognize all that and have a much more structured process. And of course, there is some worry that, sometimes big policies are decided without consultation, in back rooms and then come out and they create, major disruptions. So it is quite important to establish, fairly clear processes of consultation. Government after government in India has said it will do that. It will make transparent the process of policy setting and consult widely. But this desire to shock and awe, to do policy by jhatka, is always there because you feel nothing's moving.
Right.
But policy by jhatka today, as Dr. Raghuram pointed out in a article just yesterday or day before, doesn't work. It maybe worked when we were doing reforms for the first time, but today there's so many interests you need to consider.
Sure.
You still have to make the bold move, but the bold move doesn't mean an ill-considered or in a move which doesn't have consensus behind it.
Well,
we need to build whatever consensus we have and then push where, you can't build further consensus, but take all the interests and constituencies into account when designing it. And that is something which will help more policies get through. And we certainly need reforms. I have no doubt about it.
Right. Well, I suppose in a sense you're referring to the farm laws and the protests that we're seeing unfolding around us every day as an example of that, of what perhaps could be seen as policy by jhatka. that actually, those protests actually bring together two strands of what you mentioned about what is perhaps concerning about the way that we are going about shaping economic policy. One, that you are not consulting enough stakeholders before you push something through. And two, the fear that the occasions when you do push policy through, it largely serves the interests of a few big business conglomerates. That's something that you hear very strongly in the rhetoric from the farm protesters. Whether that's justified or not is another matter. But both those strands are actually coming together with those protests.
Well, that is precisely the problem with policy that is not done with a greater degree of transparency, right? People believe the worst of you, and that creates even further opposition. I consult with some, farm experts, and they sort of believe that it's unlikely that some of these large corporate interests want to buy directly from the farmer, but that certainly is the sense that this policy, may be targeted towards some of those interests. But I think more broadly, people say we need farm reforms, and I fully support that. We need to give the farmer a better deal, and part of that will be transforming the APMC Acts and transforming the role of mandis. But we also need to see what is working in the system right now. And different states have different degrees to which they rely on mandis. And so the issue is, how do we build on this? And often the answer is not so much one centralized policy with one size fits all, but more a decentralized structure where every state is enabled to do what is in its best interest, the best interests of its farmers. And you need to create more competition for the farmer's produce so that the farmer gets a more remunerative price. So the point is that some of these reforms, if they rolled out without sort of this kind of broader enablement, without the broader consultation, create a backlash that then actually makes it more difficult to do reforms down the line, because some of what you proposed are very much what is needed, but without the envelope of other changes, effectively they are a non-starter.
Right. Now, on the question of this big business, this kind of the idea that you have these big crony capitalists whose interests are being served, while you're right to say that in the case of the agrarian sector, it may still be more nuanced. It's not entirely clear how genuine those concerns are. Overall, though, do you see that as a worry for the Indian economy? Because, in fact, in the paper that you and Viral Acharya wrote about the concerns over bringing in corporates into banking, you did mention that it might not be the most opportune time, given the fact that there's this concern around, these kind of oligarchies being formed.
Yeah, it is a definite concern. We have one of the strongest governments in recent history, and strong governments tend to attract, strong businesses who want to exploit their relationship with the government. So I think this is one place where the government has to continuously assert that it is not in a cozy relationship with a couple of businesses. And unfortunately, if you look at the growth of business, there are a couple of businesses that have done extremely well from this regime. Of course, you could argue the same thing of previous regimes also, but the problem becomes particularly sort of important when you have a strong government. So I think one of the greatest reforms which needs to be strengthened in the greatest reforms in the past was the Competition Commission. And what we need to do is have a much stronger view of antitrust, and not just antitrust sector by sector, but also the US version of antitrust, which is, this is the Brandesian view of antitrust, are these businesses big enough to influence the political arena? And if they're big enough, then we should be careful about them. That was what led to Glass-Steagall and cutting the power of the banks in the 1930s. It is what is now a wave against big tech in the US. These guys are just too big, just too powerful. And Mark Zuckerberg can, on the turn of a switch, change political preferences in the US. He is too powerful. Facebook needs to be cut down to size. There's bipartisan sort of consensus on that. And my sense is, for a democracy, you simply cannot afford a couple of businesses being overly large. You need much more competition amongst businesses.
Right.
And therefore, you have to worry about that.
Right. Let me ask you about another paradox. One was the paradox of, as I mentioned earlier, that you have companies seemingly doing well while the economy is doing badly. The other paradox are the stock markets. Just one peak after the next. What figures?
This is across the world. It is a huge amount of liquidity, basically having no place to go. Bonds, who knows whether inflation picks up and then bond yields start dropping. But people have maxed out on bonds. It's a search for yield across the world. We lost a huge amount of flows, a lot of outflows in India in March, February, March, when COVID was a huge worry. It's come back in spades, and it's not just India. It's every emerging market. So we can look at the Sensex and feel very happy and say we're being rewarded. I mean, it is a global phenomenon. It is a phenomenon which lifts Bitcoin to 40,000 plus. It is a phenomenon which lifts Tesla to a huge multiple of many other auto companies. And so the question is, I mean, as people start whispering bubble, bubble, when does it break, and what are the consequences? Unfortunately, I believe this is a consequence of easy central bank policy. We don't know when it'll break. Things may go up some more before, and it may be that the air comes out slowly over time rather than in one go. So that's what gives everybody sort of the ability to keep concocting these stories. Tesla will become the only car company in the world because it's so good and so wonderful. And those kinds of images then allow more money to come in.
Okay. So what you're saying in simple terms is that the fact that the markets are surging does not necessarily have any bearing on what is happening in the real economy. This could also just be a function of, as you put it, a lot of cash with nowhere to go. It doesn't necessarily mean that more jobs are being created or there's more investment. It's just, where do you park the cash?
It's not uncorrelated, but it's not the whole story. In other words, certainly markets in India are taking heart from the growing mobility, the fact that caseloads are coming down steadily, debts are falling, and there is a rebound underway. The question is, do we know the true level of the scarring? For example, RBI recently came out with a report which said NPAs, which are down to, gross NPAs down to 7.5% in September from 8.5% in March. And this is telling you there's something weird going on.
Right.
If NPAs fall while you have one of the worst quarters in Indian history, in fact, the worst quarter. And that's saying that there's a lot that is being masked. RBI says these NPAs are going to go up in certain scenarios to 13.5%. Now, that's a large number. And so the question is, are we being prepared for that? Or are we letting the stock market and the euphoria sort of mask that? And I would say, by all means, use the stock market euphoria to raise your bank equity, to raise capital for the government by privatization. Take advantage of the moment. Don't say this is all illusion. Yes, Maya hai. You just go out and raise money.
Right.
But I would also say, be careful that going forward, things are going to be less rosy after the pent-up demand, after the the rich have expressed themselves. You need to worry about the longer-term scarring and how to deal with that. and that is 21, 22, later parts when it starts hitting us.
You know, I wonder if Rakesh Jhunjhunwala, the billionaire stock market investor, is watching and what he makes of this, because I don't know if you saw what he said about you in a recent. He was on an interview show, and he said that Raghuram Rajan only sees darkness when he looks at India in the last 5 years. He doesn't see any light. He only sees darkness.
Well, look, Rakesh, whenever I've met him,
Yes.
has been a very interesting sort of person to talk to. I think it's important to be bullish about India long term, but to not hide your, hide from the things that are going wrong. Anybody looking at the path of our GDP, just look at overall GDP since 2016.
Yes.
And you have to worry that something is not going right. If you talk to international investors, India was always talked about in the 2007-8 period when we were doing really well. It was Chindia, China and India. Today, very few people talk about India other than in geostrategic terms as an alternative because we're so big to China. We need to rebuild that euphoria about India, and not through Federal Reserve pumping money into India, but because people come for longer term investment. There's some of that, as I said, coming in. We need far more of that. For that, we need to build an India. Our youth are second to none. We have really, I mean, I'm working with Kriya University. The students there are fantastic. And so what we need to do is give them an opportunity to do really well in this world. And so what we need to think about again and again is what is holding us back, and being uncritical of the government, clapping every time it does whatever it does, I think is actually not helping it. Because in an echo chamber, the government then doesn't do what is necessary to do to put India back on the right track. And to imagine any government has all the answers, and people outside should just sit and, in the words of Three Idiots, say, "Tusi great ho." I think that is just.
But it's not an easy time to be a critic of a government, as you know. And I wanted to ask you about that actually, because we've spoken about the world looking at India and looking at India's economic path with some concern. What is the view of what is happening to us in terms of us as a democracy, about freedoms, individual freedoms, collective freedoms, all of that? Does that worry you?
Oh, it does worry me. And again, I want to say this is a longer term issue in India, that we certainly experienced the emergency. And we saw a lot of freedoms taken away. Luckily, for whatever reason, we had elections 2 years after it was announced. And the question is, what is it that we need to strengthen in order to have stronger checks and balances on the government, in order to have the ability to criticize and therefore set the country back on track without constant allegations of standing in the way of India's growth, you're being anti-national, you're being this and you're being that. We saw our poor farmers also being accused of a variety of bad intent. Protest is necessary in a democracy, whether it's by students, whether it's by farmers, whether it's by whoever, as an attempt in a non-violent way to get the economy back, to get the country back on track, and to try and diminish protest or silence it, then causes protest to go in other much less desirable ways. So we have a strong democracy. We have the ability to debate ideas. And I have always said that is our greatest strength. The fact that we can continue debating ideas, and innovation is really what will take us forward, both as an economy as well as a country. We have a lot to offer the world. But having a one-size-fits-all view emanating from the top and being imposed on everybody is the death of that that kind of environment. And so we need to strengthen our democracy. I mean, I was just reading the paper today about Fauci, Anthony Fauci, how he survived the Trump administration, even while sort of preaching the, what was good policy on the medical front, right? And the question is, could a Fauci survive in our administration? Being in contact with the public, but constantly trying to sort of say where the administration is going off track, and not be fired and crushed under the heels of the government.
Could he?
So I think there are some enormous strengths in India today. I think we also need to find out where our weaknesses are,
right,
and try and remedy them.
I'm just throwing that question back at you because you also, you've been in government as well. Could a Fauci have survived under the current dispensation? Someone who's speaking truth to power from within?
I think there may be people speaking truth to power from within, but we don't hear of them.
Right.
And so there may be a way of speaking truth to power, but it certainly doesn't imply speaking to the public.
But, at the same time, so there's been a regime change.
And
yes, go ahead.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And I would say in that kind of environment, it is probably very hard to speak truth to power. The temptation is to say, to go along.
Right. But, no, what I was going to say is that at least in America, of course, Fauci survived the Trump regime, but the Trump regime itself now it's over, and there's now a new guard. But this phenomenon of strongmen leaders, populist leaders, whatever one calls them, is still alive and kicking around the world. And so in that sense, this attendant risk to democracy and all the attendant freedoms, that still remains very much alive.
Well, I mean, after all, it's people who are putting their faith in the strong leader, right? There were 80 million people or so who voted for Trump.
Yeah.
And there are many people in every democracy with strong men. There are people who are voting for those strong men. So there is something in the allure of somebody who will fix all your problems,
sure,
and who has a direct connection to the people, who is seen as non-corrupt, who is seen as the person who gives you this and gives you that, and who unfortunately is being held hostage by a deep state which doesn't do what he wants them to do, by a deep state that is still corrupt, that is this thing. But, give them more time and they will do it.
Right.
I think that's a very powerful narrative. The question is how much of the narrative is true and how much of the state is really, at odds with this leader,
right,
and how much of it is really doing the leader's bidding.
Now, as we start to wind down, let me kind of take you up in a sense in the gauntlet that Rakesh Jhunjhunwala threw at you, saying that you only see darkness, you don't see anything positive about India. What do you see anything in recent times that has been a good piece of news coming out of India? On a lighter note, I just wanted to flag the fact that someone from your fraternity, banker Aditya Puri of HDFC, was voted as world's best banker by the Economist recently. So it was a good, that was shortly
there are so many
before he retired.
There are so many good things happening in India. Even Jhunjhunwala says I was against the farm bill, though I was pro-reform. No, I was pro-reform, but and I was pro some of the elements of the farm bill, but sure, I was against the way it had been done and against the way that it hadn't recognized there were more complications than what an economist sitting in a back room would think about, that you needed to have an engagement with the people and therefore
sure,
articulate a more responsive farm bill. But there's so many good things. I keep talking about Enfield, which has been revived and is now selling motorcycles in the United States. That's an example of a success story. HDFC Bank, I mean, I have great admiration for what Aditya Puri managed to achieve there. And it's a fantastic story of rebuilding, of building from first principles, but becoming a very effective bank. Our software sort of startups that we're seeing even today are enormously, I think, interesting. One of the things that our ban of TikTok did was to create more space for startups who wanted to enter that space, and we see a lot of those also.
But that's
emerging.
still no. Sorry to jump in. Those are still examples of private entrepreneurship. Can you name one good thing that you think the government has done in recent past?
Good question. I think the government has done a lot on distribution. And in a sense, this has been the reason why it has had such fiscal stress. We have done far more on implementing some of the schemes that were around.
Distribution, you mean in terms
distribution,
like
in terms of direct cash transfers to people, in terms of the cooking gas to a lot of households, in terms of the shauchalaya, the free toilet, in terms of the Indra Awas Yojana, sort of broadening it and implementing more of it, in terms of electrification. These are all and the bank accounts, the Jan Dhan Yojana. These are all ways that people's lives have become better. I've always said the government focused on these and has done a reasonable job on a lot of this. This is important, but it is also the reason why, on the other hand, we haven't had growth. So we've spent the money. We don't have now, the revenues. That's why we're running large deficits. And now we certainly need to focus on growth and job creation. That has been, in many ways, the place where the government hasn't done a good job.
Right. Listening to you always makes me seem you're so still plugged into everything that's happening here, and you still have such strong views about it. Do you ever feel tempted about coming back to once again get into some kind of government policy role? I don't know.
No, I think what is most important right now is certainly in the education sphere. I am so excited by the young in our country. And I also worry that this pandemic will set a lot of kids back. And whatever little we can do there, I think we should do. So that is my current focus, that I really think we should focus on making sure that the human capital of this country, which can allow us to leapfrog a generation in terms of, earlier what countries used to do is start with the low-level manufacturing and then move up the ladder over time. If we can get our kids with human capital, especially with the fact that we've now learned to do business at a distance, in fact, business from anywhere, that wave we can catch. Our kids can become doctors to the world, not just to India. They should be doctors to India, lawyers to the world, consultants to the world. But for that, we need to strengthen education significantly.
Right. No, that's important what you just said, but you kind of deflected my question. I put it out on Twitter saying you have questions for Dr. Rajan, and someone has asked this question much more directly. Will you accept the role of the finance minister if it's offered to you by the Prime Minister?
That's a complete hypothetical, and given what we've talked about in this program, that's even more hypothetical. So let's not go there. I think we all need to do our bit, and we find whatever bit we can do in the environment we are in. The other place where I think we really need to come together is to reflect on what we thought India was going to become. And where we are now. I mean, when I look at what our founding the Constituent Assembly and Constitution Assembly and others thought, and where we are now, some of their fears are coming true. Of course, some of their ambitions and hopes have also come true. So this is a point for a reset, to offer an alternative set of ideas going forward, both on the economic side as well as the political side, to see what we need to change to ensure we actually capture the next 20 years as opposed to are a victim of the next 20 years. So we really need to focus on the future right now, and that requires reflecting on what we've done well, what we haven't,
Sure.
and what needs to change, both politically and economically.
Okay, well said. Dr. Raghuram Rajan, pleasure to have you as always. Thank you so much indeed for speaking to us. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you.